All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. We've been talking databases, and in particular, I've been going over the first 12 chapters of the book you see right in front of you. That is SQL, A Beginner's Guide, 3rd edition by Andy Oppel and Robert Sheldon. And as I mentioned, although the book has 3 sections, I believe, in it, Section 1, Relational Databases and SQL. Section 2, which we're in right now, Data Access and Modification. Section 3, Advanced Data Access. And Part 4, which are the appendices. All right. And what I'm going through in this series of lectures are the first 12 chapters. Whoops. So there we are. We're up to Chapter 12 of the 12 I'm going to go through, and that is using subqueries to access and modify data. Now, basically, a subquery is a query within a query. You're going to see what that means as we go on. It's one of the harder concepts to kind of get a handle around, for lack of better words, in this language. What I should do, and have not done yet, is to get into XAMPP, start up XAMPP, begin Apache and MySQL. Let's go into the shell as we've been doing, MySQL -u root, and there we are. And we will use Acme, which is the database we've been working with. All right. So you can see we have 5 different objectives here. Create subqueries that return multiple rows, create subqueries that return a single value, work with what are known as correlated subqueries, use nested subqueries, and finally the chapter ends, the last few pages, talks about using subqueries to modify data. In other words, using subqueries for insert, update, and delete purposes. All right, 2 things about subqueries as we get started. No, it's not in the text here, but there are two things I'm mentioning. Number 1, as far as I can tell, anytime you use a subquery, which again is a query within a query, but anytime you use a subquery, you can do a similar operation without using subqueries. In other words, they're never mandatory. And I know, or have known in the past, of SQL programmers who try to keep away from them because they just find them very difficult. So that's the first thing. And a lot of times with a subquery, you can do the same thing with a join. All right. Well, that's the first thing. So, I said there were 2 things. Well, the other thing is, subqueries don't really have to be that hard of a thing, because really what you're doing with a subquery is you're running an inner query and you're using the output of the inner query as the input to the outer query. Now that's a mouthful, and I'm kind of surprised I was able to say it without making a mistake. But the idea is, rather than running 2 different queries, what you're doing with a subquery is you're combining them into one. So why would you want to do that? Well, in the examples that we've been going through, when you have only 10 records, there probably is very little reason for you to even use a subquery. But as you get in and start using databases with thousands, getting into millions, getting into possibly billions of records, then quite often time constraints become really important. Imagine, for example, that you're working for a ticket agency, something like Ticketmaster, where I believe, at least I think it used to be this way, and I think it is, that if I say I want to go to a concert and I bring up a window, then usually for around 90 seconds, they basically close all the ticket sales for that concert except for me, because they don't know what tickets I want to buy. All right? And so it's very time dependent is what I'm saying. Okay. So they started doing this in Chapter 9, and I kind of glossed over the in and the exist that were in Chapter 9. All right, just because of the fact that I figured this would be a better time to start going over the information. So we can divide subqueries in a where clause into two general categories, as is mentioned right here. Okay, those that can return multiple rows, which is what they're going to talk about first. And then in the next section, they'll get into those that return a single value. All right. Despite the fact that my discussion focuses on subqueries implemented through a where clause, they're not implemented in that clause. You can use them with a select or a having, but what the author is saying here is, by and large, most of the examples that they are using here, all right, will be putting a select clause inside of a where statement, okay? A query within a query. So the first type of subquery that they're going to look at in here is the type used within the in predicate. As it says from Chapter 9, the in predicate compares values from a column in the primary table to values returned from the subquery. If the column value is in the subquery results, that row is returned. So the author says, okay, let's imagine here that what we want is we want to find out, I believe it's everything that's by Joni Mitchell. And you can see here that Joni Mitchell has a CD that's called Blue and one that's called Court and Spark. And from what I can tell, that's the only one she has in there. All right. And also, Court and Spark has 22 in stock and Blue has 42 in stock. So they're going to write a query. And as you can see right here, it says select star from the in stock where the title is in. So what happens is you run this first. Select title from CD artists where artist name is Joni Mitchell. And that gives Blue and Court and Spark. All right. So that's the output of this inner query. So then we run select star from CD in stock where CD title basically is either Blue or Court and Spark. And we end up with this. There's the title, there's the in stock, there's the title, there's the in stock. So as the author says here, only 2 rows are returned from the stock table, which represent the 2 CDs we have in here performed by Joni Mitchell. Even though the CD stock table does not include artist information, we can still tie the 2 tables together because they include similar columns. There's a lot of stuff in this query. So we're grabbing stuff from CD stock and we're grabbing stuff from CD artists. Now the database that I have is not really well suited for going through most of these examples. So I guess I'm going to punt a little bit here. And what I mean is, by and large, most of the stuff that I'm going to discuss in here is I'm just going to look at the examples that are in the chapter. Now, maybe that's cheating a little bit, whatever you want to say. But this is, again, amongst the most complex topics that we have in here. All right. So on 281 at the top of the page, in some instances, you might want your query to return only a value of true or false. Notice it uses the word exists in here. So exists will return true if 1 or more rows are returned by the subquery, and exists will return false if nothing is returned. Now we're used to, when nothing is returned, having the empty set be there, and when we have no values that meet the criteria. But now we're basically talking about using, having false. As it says here, for an exist predicate to be useful, the associated subquery should include a search condition that matches values in the 2 tables that are being linked through the subquery. So what the author does here is basically repeats the same query that was done previously, but this time uses an exists. So this says right here, this inner query says select title from CD artists, which they call A, where the name is Joni Mitchell, and, all right, the CD stock title is equal to the artist title. We get the same results. We're going to get, for titles, we're going to get blue, and we're going to get Cord and Spark. So it will return true because indeed something does exist. All right, and that will be used here, and we'll get the same results that we had before. Now, since our data is here, had we put in, instead of Joni Mitchell, let's say we put in John Mitchell, it would have returned nothing. As was the case with the in predicate, the exists allows you to use the subquery to access information in another table. Even though CD stock does not include information about artists, the subquery allows you to return data. It's kind of an important topic there, because when you look, this particular example, the inner query is referencing s dot something, even though we don't have s dot something in our from. It's grabbing the s dot from in there. All right. Again, this is very powerful stuff. 282, they talk about using quantified comparison attributes. And it's mentioned there, the in and exists are not the only predicates you can use. You can use some, any, or all. And notice here, some and any perform the same function. They check to see whether any return values meet the search requirement, whereas the all predicate checks to make sure that all return values meet the search requirement. When you use one of these quantified comparisons, the values from the column in the primary table are compared with the values returned from the subquery. So they show yet another example. Now this is a little confusing. This inner query says, select the price from the sales prices table where the prices are less than $15.99. So if we looked right here, there's less than $15.99, there is, and there is. All right. So those, all of the ones that are shown right there are the ones that are less than $15.99. But then we want the CD name and the price where the price is greater than any of these. So we want everything shown except these. So here, the real price, which I think that is what that is greater than the highest price returned by the subquery, which was, says in this case, would be $14.99. A little bit, as I said, a little bit confusing. Creating subqueries that return one value. So far, we've looked at subqueries that can return one or more rows of data, but sometimes what you want to do is you want your subquery to return only one value so that you can compare the values in one column with a single subquery value. In that case, you use the comparison operators, which we've talked about in many chapters. Greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, and not equal to. So what we have here is virtually, not quite, but virtually the same query. So we're selecting the maximum price, which I believe is $16.99. And then we're saying, okay, what I want is I want you to search and find everything, all the CD names and prices that are $16.99. Now, in this example, they use max, but as mentioned here, you don't have to use an aggregate function like max, but quite often you will. All right. Jumping up to page 284 at the bottom of the page and going on to 285 and 286, they talk about what are referred to as correlated subqueries. Now, by default, subqueries work from the inside out. But with a correlated subquery, for lack of better words, it almost works from the outside in. So the author mentions here in the using the exist predicate section earlier in the chapter, they mentioned that for the exist predicate to be useful, it should include a subquery, in the subquery, a search condition that matches values in the two tables. They go back and they repeat the query that we did at an earlier time. So the matching of values, as they say, it's similar to what we done if we had done an equijoin. The reason that the author says that they're returning to this statement is that it includes a type of query that was not discussed before, and that's the correlated subquery. A correlated subquery, as mentioned here, is one that is dependent on the outer statement in some way. In most of the queries that we looked at in this chapter, in fact, most of the, anytime we've talked about subqueries, which has basically been this chapter, the subquery has stood independently of the outer statement, something like this. We could run this query without even worrying about that one. We'd get answers. So in this case, as mentioned here with the example that they're showing here, the subquery merely returns results which are then used in the outer statement. The subquery is evaluated just one time, and the results are used in the main statement as they're necessary. With a correlated subquery, as mentioned here, on the other hand, the subquery must often be reevaluated for each row that's returned by the outer statement. The correlated subquery cannot be evaluated just once because at least one of the values will change for each row. So again, as mentioned, for lack of better words, what they are doing there is they're kind of going from the outside in as opposed to from the inside out. As I said, do I have an understanding of this? Yes. Have I used this before? Not in a lot of depth. What I've typically tried to do is, rather than do this, I have tried to find a way of doing the same thing with joins or something similar. So up to this point, we've looked at select statements that include only one subquery, but you can have as many as you want. You can have as many as you need. You can have a nested subquery. And here's an example. Now, this will again, to my knowledge, will do this. We'll select the disk type ID when the disk type name is blues. Whatever output we get will be used here to select the artist for those particular disk types. And that output will be used here. And I've had people ask in the past, okay, I sort of see what you're doing here, but can you give me a reason why we'd want to do this? Bottom line is, in my humble opinion, it all goes down to speed. Sometimes you have to write very complex queries because you need information. You might literally be drilling through millions, again, possibly billions of records, looking for one or two or whatever that meet your criteria, and it's time dependent. All right? The last thing that's discussed in the chapter on the last couple pages is using subqueries to modify data. You know that an insert statement allows you to add data to an existing table. You can add data directly to the table, or you can do it through a view. If you use a subquery in an insert statement, you must include it as one of the values defined in the values clause. And they give an example right here. Again, fairly heavy stuff. You could very much argue right here and say, well, I think there's an easier way to do it than that, and there probably is. For the most part, as the author says here, using a subquery in an insert is a relatively simple process. But notice, relatively simple process. And the bottom line is it simple? It depends on what your definition of simple is. All right, you can also use subqueries to update data. It says to use the subquery in an update statement, you can include it in a predicate in the where clause. And there is an example. You're using an update, okay? And finally, you can use a subquery to delete data. So again, you have a select inside of here. Now that's pretty much it. I've made the semi-conscious decision that what I'm going to do next is I'm going to come in and I've got something that I have been using for my class that I found online. It's called MySQL by Example for Beginners. There's the table of contents right there. But this is about a 40-page document, and I'm going to start going through that next. I'm doing it with my class, but I'm going to go and do it very, very slowly here also. All right, so that's what I'll be doing next.